Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lovely to have your company this morning. Been a funny old weekend. Now, ordinarily we have a minister from the government and a shadow minister to discuss the issues of the week. And we did ask for Victoria Atkins to come on for the government, and we asked for Rachel Reeves, the shadow chancellor, to come on and discuss their tax and spend plans, but they decided not to. Clearly, they don't care enough about GB viewers and listeners to talk about how they plan to spend your money. So just with that in mind, we decided to invite some grown-ups on the show instead. So I'm delighted to say that we've got Alan Milburn, who's a new Labour bigwig and also served as Health Secretary, to discuss Tony Blair's NHS reform plans. He's been intervening again into the NHS by suggesting that you should be able to jump the queue, pay to jump the queue, a bit of part privatisation for the former Labour Prime Minister. I'm also going to be speaking to Sir Ian Duncan Smith, former Tory leader and a big figure on the right of the party. I want to ask him whether the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is right to rule out tax cuts ahead of the next general election. We're also going to be discussing everything involving Ukraine and indeed the forthcoming NATO summit in Lithuania, which happens next week. We've got Biden flying in tonight with the former Deputy Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Simon Mayall, and he'll be talking us through that, as well as Biden's suggestions that we should send cluster bombs to Ukraine. And we've got a London mayoral hopeful in. Mozammel Hossain will be joining us as part of a series where we hope to next week interview his opponent, Susan Hall. They both want the mayoral crown. But let's first of all just run through the front pages of the newspapers. Let's start with the Sunday Telegraph. Now, this is a big story we'll be discussing in just a minute. BBC under fire over explicit pictures scandal. The Sunday Times also goes with that story. It's significant to see the broadsheets both covering BBC crisis over star paying teens for sex photos. The Observer goes with reopen UK borders to EU workers. That's an interview with former Environmental Secretary George Eustace. Sunday Mirror, BBC star partied with bosses after sex complaint. The Sunday Express has got an update to a story that affects my fellow GB News presenter Nigel Farage. Woke banks a risk to national security, and this is about how defence companies are struggling to get bank accounts. Mail on Sunday goes with, again, the BBC crisis over top star in sex photos probe. And The Sun on Sunday, unsurprisingly, because it broke the story, The Sun, in the week, BBC star sent pants pic to teens. Mum's shock at X-rated mobile image. Well, blimey O'Reilly, what a story. And to discuss all that, I'm joined by Michael Crick, a legend of a political reporter, former Newsnight and Channel 4 news political editor. Thank you for joining me, Michael. Let's get started on the sex scandal that is currently on the front pages. I mean, it's a difficult one, this, because, of course, legally we're rather restricted as to what we say, and these are only allegations. But again, it mires the BBC in controversy. I don't know how many paper reviews I've done where the BBC has been on the front pages for all the wrong reasons.
Well, this is a biggie, if the story's true. And I think in the next few days, we're not only going to learn who this presenter is, but also the BBC's it looks like the BBC's in a lot of trouble because the mother of the teenager, and it's not clear whether it's a male or female teenager, yes, says they have complained to the BBC. Well, what happened to that complaint? Was it followed up? It appears not to have been. And so the BBC is going to be in trouble for that. For not responding.
And it's got history because of Savile and Rolf Harris and Stuart Hall.
And that was the pattern. That was the pattern that we saw then. Yes.
How damaging do you think it is?
Well, it's hugely damaging. I think it's bigger than most of the BBC scandal. I mean, there is a BBC scandal every year or so these days, but I think it's bigger than nearly all of them.
A household name.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to another household name, at least in Tory politics. We're calling this Just Stop Oil stunt of the week. What do we make? I know you know the bride in this case. So Thea Rogers, I think, used to be one of your producers.
That's right.
Married George Osborne yesterday. Lovely ceremony, but it gets disrupted by a Just Stop Oil protester. Yeah,
no, Thea used to work for me when I was on Newsnight and worked with me, and she was a brilliant producer. But after a few weeks, she was poached by Nick Robinson, who I see was a guest at the wedding yesterday.
Very good.
And yeah, I mean, there's a woman here. Look, it looks quite an elderly woman actually, throwing orange confetti.
Yeah, I mean, it's only confetti.
Yeah, and
should she have
I
been
think
there?
the papers have made a bit too much of this. It's not the worst in the thing of the world.
But he's not a member of government.
He's not a member of government. The trouble, if you have a rural wedding like that, though, it is quite a public event. You know, people gather around, the people from the community. There were lots of cameras there, lots of press there. And, of course, they've also suffered, which is, I think, is much more serious. This email that went out to all the wedding guests in recent days.
Email, the contents of which we can't really discuss.
No, but all sorts of stuff about their private lives, basically.
Yes, it's uncomfortable. Do you think it's damaging for Labour to be associated with Dale Vince, who's given them money but is also a backer of Just Stop Oil? Well,
this is the basic problem Labour has, that to many Labour supporters, you know, sort of the middle-class ones from the kind of seats they're trying to win back in the South, they may not be so worried about that. But what Labour also has to bear in mind is the red wall seats, the working class seats in the Midlands and the North and so on, where that may be a problem. So I think there are mixed views on that.
Let's look at the bank ban latest. Obviously, it's an issue close to my fellow GB News presenter Nigel Farage's heart because he's had his banking completely interfered with. He's not able to open a bank account with Coutts anymore because they've banned him. We now hear from the Sunday Express, woke banks a risk to national security. We also hear that even the Chancellor, according to the Sunday Telegraph, had been denied a bank account. This is becoming... I thought this story would sort of be a one-person story and it would just dampen down. We've heard from people who have gender-critical views have been banned from a bank account. Now the Chancellor... The
former Chancellor, Ken Clarke.
Yes, that's astonishing as well.
And lots of members of the House of Lords. And if there are all these bigwigs, all these establishment figures who are being... well, Farage isn't really an establishment figure, he might like to be. But if they're all being prevented from having bank accounts, then what's it like for the general public? And this is in a world where it's increasingly difficult to operate these days unless you've got bank accounts, unless you've got credit cards. You know, a lot of payments you can't make with cash anymore, as indeed GB News has been campaigning on that.
We're campaigning.
This is a very serious issue, and I think the government really needs to, Parliament needs to investigate, and, you know, maybe as last resort, the Bank of England needs to start providing bank accounts, personal bank accounts.
They're too busy replacing their boilers with heat pumps and saying that men can get pregnant at the moment, Michael, to be concerning themselves with that. Let's talk about Blue Labour, because the Times front page is interesting. Labour mirrors Tory spending plans. This is a bit of an odd way to campaign.
It is, but that's the way that campaigning happens in this country these days. It happened way back in 1997, you'll remember, when Tony Blair was trying to get into government, and successfully did, and Labour committed themselves to Ken Clarke's spending plans, and afterwards Ken Clarke said, they were bonkers. I wasn't going to stick to those spending plans myself. Now, the situation may be slightly different. And, of course, the Conservatives, when they were in opposition 20 years ago, they committed to Labour's spending plans for quite a long time.
Like the electorate looks at both parties and says there isn't really a fag paper between them. There's no jeopardy now in the Tories saying, oh, don't vote for Labour, they're going to spend more of your money. They're taxing us to the hilt.
And then there's another story in the Sunday Times about how, you know, Starmer saying he doesn't like, I'm not interested in tree huggers. In fact, I hate them.
Apparently that's a discussion with Ed Miliband.
That's right.
Mr. Tree Hugger, isn't he?
I mean, here is Labour really trying to make it look like it's not really. He's not really. It's a repeat of the new Labour strategy from 25 years ago, which of course was very successful.
Do you think it'll work again, Michael?
Well, it looks like it's working. Starmer is not a Tony Blair, you know, and of course Starmer was meeting Rupert Murdoch the other day, just as Blair did all those years ago.
They all do that, regardless of what they say about it. Let's look at the by-elections then, because we've had the archetypal photograph of a Prime Minister hugging a baby, well, almost hugging a baby, looking at a baby. He's gone up to Selby. I mean, he needs to, because it looks like the Tories... Do you think they might lose all these by-elections? I think they will lose all these by-elections. Really? Well, we've got 3 scheduled at the moment, haven't we? Selby and Uxbridge and Somerset and Frome, which is the Lib Dems are hoping to take that. Mid-beds because Nadine is...
Well, I don't think that by-election will ever happen. I think she will carry on until the general election.
And then we're also waiting on Chris Pincher potentially freeing up his seat.
In Tamworth, but the 3 that are taking place on July the 20th, I think that is going to be 3 defeats for the Conservatives. I think actually the Conservatives' best hope, I think, ironically, although is Uxbridge, even though the margin for Labour is less. Well, because Uxbridge is complicated.
There's an interestingly named Labour candidate for Uxbridge, I understand. Oh, we're not allowed to talk.
We're not allowed to name candidates, no. And also the whole ULEZ policy, the ultra-low emission zone policy, which is put forward by Sadiq Khan, and both Keir Starmer and the party in Uxbridge have disowned it. Yes.
By the way, if we name one candidate, we have to name them all, and we don't have time. That's
right.
And I've got Mozammel Hossain coming in. I mean, a ULEZ might be a big issue, but in general, I mean, seeing Rishi Sunak going to Selby, is that a sign of desperation?
No.
Prime Ministers always used to go and campaign in by-elections?
They did, up until about 20 years ago, they didn't. And then Tony Blair started it, funnily enough, in Uxbridge, after his 97 election victory with a majority of 176. He got greedy. He decided he wanted to increase the majority by another 2. So he went and campaigned in Uxbridge. David Cameron campaigned 5 times in Rochester and Stroud. So it is, these days, Prime Ministers do campaign in by-elections. And, of course, you've got to remember that Rishi Sunak is a Yorkshire MP, and this is taking a North Yorkshire MP, and it's fairly local
too. He's in that northern Richmond, not the southern one. And just a final word, please, on Nadeem Zahawi. What is he doing in a sentence, Michael?
This is extraordinary. We haven't heard from the former Chancellor, Nadeem Zahawi, since he was pushed out of government by a scandal.
Well, he did back Daniel Korski literally an hour before Daniel Korski stood down. But anyway, carry on.
And he's now appearing in an ITV drama about the post office scandal, the postmaster scandal that ITV are doing, playing himself, a backbench MP.
An interesting segue career-wise. We wait.
Well, it's a sign. It's a sign that all these Conservative MPs really haven't got enough to do at Westminster, and they're going off and doing other things, like being GB News presenters.
Well, nothing wrong with that, Michael. Nothing wrong with that.
Well, I don't know.
We'd love to see them on GB News. Now, Michael Crick, thank you very much, as ever, biting with your commentary. Now, Olivia Utley is in Medway. Olivia, what questions have the panel got for our guest today?
Yes, I'm in a rather drizzly Rochester this morning, but we've got a perfect English scene behind us, and we're very excited to be with another fantastic people's panel at Tiny Tim's of Rochester. Lovely little cafe here, and they're really looking forward to putting their questions to your politicians this morning. But first, let me introduce you to Steve. He's the manager of Tiny Tim's here in Rochester. Lovely cafe. We love the Union Jacks, the God Save the King banner behind the counter, just what we like to see at GB News. And how's business going for you, Steve?
Business is good. It's going all right at the moment, bearing in mind with rising costs. We're still battling on. The books are fully booked for a few more weeks, which is good.
Excellent. Is there anything the government could be doing to make life a bit easier for you?
Try and reduce the energy bills. They're going up to shockingly high, as has been tripled in the past 3 months. So, yeah, just need them to come down.
Yeah, I think there are quite a lot of small business owners up and down the country who would very much agree with you there. But thank you for having us so much in this beautiful cafe this morning. Yeah, and this is our fantastic People's panel. Today we've got Ben, we've got Martin, and we've got Paul. And of course, one of the big stories this week is the 75th anniversary of the NHS. And Ben, we were talking a little bit about this earlier. There are those who say that without urgent reform, the NHS won't make it to its 100th birthday. Do you think that's right, or is that a bit of an overreaction?
I think it is right. I think you have to look at every single option. If reform can make it progress, then absolutely 100% do it. If you just think that giving it money is going to make it grow, then you need to do loads more work than that, 100%. But I don't trust neither Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer to fix it.
I mean, Rishi Sunak has a pledge to cut waiting lists.
Of course he has, yeah.
Yeah, I think that sort of scepticism is something which quite a few voters around the country would probably agree with, and it'll be fascinating to see what those voting in by-elections for the next few weeks make of Rishi Sunak's progress on the NHS. And of course, Martin, one of the other big issues facing the country at the moment is, in general, the state of the economy. Steve's talking there about high energy bills. That's a worry for lots of people. And also soaring mortgage rates, not good for homeowners.
Yeah, first of all, welcome to Rochester, Olivia. And secondly, pass on my congratulations to the GB News teams that won the recent Trick Awards. As far as the economy is concerned, I think both Rishi Sunak and Andrew Bailey have a lot to answer for. Rishi Sunak needs to answer why he spread money like confetti during the COVID crisis, and Andrew Bailey allowed inflation to rise as it did when your own Liam Halligan was calling it out a couple of years ago. So I feel sorry for young people nowadays who are facing this mortgage crisis. Rates of 7% are envisaged. And it's not fair on them when they're just trying to make a start in life. They are carrying the heaviest burden.
Well, as a just about youngish person with a new mortgage, I sympathise with that. And Paul, another issue that we've been talking about quite a lot this week is strikes. We've seen public sector workers go on strike for days and days at a time over the last year, and it shows no time of ending anytime soon. Teachers walked out last week, and we can expect to see more of that in the new term. What do you make of that? Is it sustainable?
Well, of course it's not sustainable. I mean, the government need to talk to these people and try and resolve the issues, like, instead of just walking away from the table all the time. I mean, Mick Lynch started a trend and everyone's jumped on the bandwagon. You know, it's just there doesn't seem to be an end in sight at the moment. There needs to be some discussions.
Absolutely. And your daughter's a nurse, so she must be feeling this pretty hard.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, those all promised a pay rise. And apparently only people that are in trust are going to get the backdated pay rise. The rest of them aren't going to get it.
Exactly. Pretty worrying for all involved. We'll be back to our Fantastic People's panel later, but for now, over to Camilla in the studio.
We'll go to gbnews.com/panel. Now, I'm delighted to be joined now by Alan Milburn, former Health Secretary under Tony Blair, former Chair of the Social Mobility Commission, also former Labour MP for Darlington. Alan, lovely to speak to you this morning. Let's talk about Keir Starmer's plans for education, because I know that you wrote a piece for The Times in the week where you supported him putting oracy at the centre of what he was planning for children's education. You wrote, and I quote, "The educational attainment gap between poor kids and their better-off classmates is widening, not narrowing." Do you still believe that class determines children's outcomes more than, say, their own work ethic or indeed ability?
I think all of those things are important. I mean, social mobility is not something that can be gifted to people. It's obviously about hard work, effort, and then you get a reward. At least that was how I was brought up. That's what I was brought up to believe. But equally, we know that there's a very, very strong correlation between educational attainment, how well kids do in schools, and the background that they come from. And actually, that correlation between social class and educational performance is stronger than it is for race or for gender. And that gap remains very wide, and probably COVID has widened it. And that's a real problem, because it means that thousands of kids in our country who've got real potential are not getting the opportunities to progress in life that they would want or their parents would want.
It's interesting you mentioned the pandemic, because I was going to ask you whether you felt that coronavirus and the way that harmed children's education with school closures, etc., do you think that has stilted social mobility in this country?
Yes, I think it probably has. And I think we're beginning to see, are we not now? You talk to any teacher or head teacher, and the first thing almost that they will tell you, I was in Barnsley earlier this week, for example, and meeting a college principal there and employers, and they were talking there about the mental health problems that are now becoming obvious, at least to them, and probably to parents too, as a consequence really of what happened during COVID. But it goes much deeper than COVID. It's a systemic problem. It's been with us for very many years, if not decades. And as I say, it's all the way through from the early years through to university education. It's a shocker, really, that we still have an educational system which is, if you like, biased against, if you like, people from lower income backgrounds, certainly in terms of their performance. And I think that's why the focus on oracy and school reform is so important, because in today's world, you need to be able to communicate, you need to be able to collaborate, you need to be able to work with others. And the education system that we have, and indeed the curriculum that we have, is really a bit outdated, and it's time to change it.
Let's move on to the NHS, as you were Health Secretary for that period under Blair. Now, he said in 1997 that you had 24 hours to save the NHS. How would you assess the NHS now, all these years on?
Well, look, I've been around, as you're indicating, many decades around health policy, and I can honestly say this is the worst I've ever seen it in. It really is close to breaking point. I think social care, by the way, is probably broken. And so we've got a real problem. And what really compounds the felony, if you like, is that there's no plan to get out of this situation. People say it can't be done. I don't believe that. I faced a very similar situation back in the late 90s. People were waiting 18 months, 2 years for a hospital operation. People will remember that. And we got the waiting times down over the course of a number of years to no more than 18 weeks. People could get to see a GP, now they can't. Cancer outcomes were improving and so on. So it is possible to do it, but you do need a plan. And critically, you need not just money, but you do need radical reform of the system, because it's just not set up to deal with today's problems. Hospitals tend to absorb most cash in the NHS, when what we really need is a system that keeps people healthy and out of hospitals so they can be looked after in the community. But unfortunately, over these last few years, if you think of the number of GPs, for example, they've fallen by about 7% since 2015. And that means that people needlessly end up in hospital.
Do you think that Sajid Javid's suggestion of having a royal commission to look at how the NHS should be reformed is a good idea?
No, I don't. I mean, I think all that does is introduce yet more delay. The truth is the government should be getting on with it. If there's a change of government, it needs to get on with it. We broadly know what needs to be done, really. We know, for example, that 1 in 4 people who are in hospital today shouldn't be there, providing they can be diagnosed and treated soon enough. We know that 1 in 5 emergency admissions to hospital are potentially preventable. So what we've got to do is turn the system around, get the money in the right place, but critically do these big reforms. Earlier this week, I was at the Crick Institute in London, which is one of the leading global centres, for example, in genomic science. And you begin to see there what's possible, because we can move to a world where, rather than just diagnosing and treating people, we can now predict and prevent health. And that's what the system should be focused on. How are we going to harness that enormous technological revolution? People hear a lot about artificial intelligence. It's got a part to play. But genomic science is really the game changer. We're going to be able to predict whether you're going to get ill, and then we can do something to prevent it. And that's far more sensible. And by the way, much cheaper than getting people into hospital.
And yet Tony Blair's institute is suggesting a degree of part privatisation. It's talking about wealthier people being able to pay to jump the queue. There's also been talk about charging for GP appointments, for fining people if they miss appointments. What do you think of those ideas?
Well, I think what Tony Blair was talking about this week was just simply alerting people to the fact that there are options available for them. And of course there are, but let's be clear about this. For the overwhelming majority of people, the overwhelming majority of the time, it's going to be the NHS that is their go-to provider, and rightly so, because it provides care according to the right principle, which is the size of your need, not the size of your wallet. However, this is what we really got to think about. We've got to think about how do we use the private sector in all of its guises, not just private providers to treat NHS patients, but just think about all the advances that we're seeing in biomedicine. If we think about the advances that we're seeing in machine learning, they don't come from the public sector, they come from the private sector. And in my view, we should have a very open mind about how we utilize private sector capability and capacity to treat NHS patients. That's what we did all years ago. It was a contributor to getting NHS waiting lists down, and it can be again.
But has Starmer got the solutions to these problems? Admittedly, the Labour Party are well ahead of the Conservatives in the polls, but at the same time, the electorate seems to be rather ambivalent about Sir Keir. He's not the heir to Blair, is he?
Well, he's a very different type of character. That's perfectly obvious. But honestly, I think he's been seriously underestimated, Keir Starmer. I mean, I read the report that came out on the NHS. I read the one that came out this week, as you're saying, Camilla, on education. There are some really radical reform ideas in there. And the thing that he's got is that, look, the country's in a terrible mess. It's not just the NHS, it's across the piece. You've been talking about strikes. You know, we're going to have to transition the economy because it's going to become greener over time. We need to think about new jobs. But I think the thing that he's recognised above all else, these are deep-seated challenges. They're going to take time to put right, and you need a serious government with a serious plan in order to do that.
OK. Alan Milburn, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Lots more to come on today's show. I'm going to be speaking to former Tory leader Sir Ian Duncan Smith in just a minute. But first, here's the weather.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. We've got heavy showers in the forecast once again today, but there will be plenty of sunny spells too, still feeling quite warm and humid. And low pressure sits to the west of us at the moment, bringing in those showers across the UK, some of them heavy and thundery at times. And as we move through the next few days, that low pressure just starts to move over us, so increasing the risk of those heavy showers even more. This morning, plenty of sunshine from the word go, though we do have some patchy rain across southeast England, a few heavier bursts possible here, and also rain clearing the far north of Scotland. But it is the showers we're going to watch as we move through the day. They'll turn particularly heavy across parts of Northern Ireland, across into Wales, the Midlands, southwest England. Some rumbles of thunder, hail, gusty winds possible too. In between, though, plenty of sunny spells, and that'll lift temperatures towards the mid-20s. As we move through the evening time, we'll continue to see showers push north across the UK, some of them heavy and thundery. We could see some local travel disruption, but they should fade away as we end the day. And then most places dry overnight with clear spells, perhaps a few shallow mist and fog patches forming by the end of the night. A little fresher tonight, temperatures generally 12 to 15 Celsius in most towns and cities, a little lower in the countryside, but it means plenty of sunshine for Monday morning, just some cloud and patchy rain across the far north of Scotland. And then as that low pressure edges near us, we will see outbreaks of rain starting to move in, affecting parts of Northern Ireland, West Wales, the West Country, up into western Scotland too. Some showers here. Best of the sunshine across eastern and southeast England. Here temperatures reaching again close to the mid-20s. A little bit fresher as the breeze picks up further west and that rain moves in. It stays unsettled as that low pressure moves in over the coming days. Further heavy showers across the UK and temperatures starting to come down a little nearer to average. See you soon.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. In just a jiffy, I'm going to be speaking to former Tory leader Sir Ian Duncan Smith. Don't go anywhere. First, here's the headlines with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Camilla. New allegations have emerged about the BBC presenter who allegedly paid a teenager tens of thousands of pounds for explicit images. The young person's mother has told The Sun she saw a photo of the man in his underwear on her child's phone, which looked like it was taken from a video call. To quell speculation, a number of BBC presenters posted messages on social media to say they're not involved in the scandal. MPs are now calling for a full and transparent investigation. The broadcaster says it treats any allegations seriously. Britain is preparing to host the US president, who's due to arrive this evening. Joe Biden will meet the King at Windsor Castle tomorrow. He'll then hold talks with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, where he is expected to raise concerns over Brexit. America's decision to send cluster munitions to Ukraine could also be discussed. Well, Joe Biden's visit comes ahead of the NATO summit in Lithuania, where the Prime Minister will urge allies to bolster their defence spending. Speaking in Vilnius on Tuesday, Rishi Sunak is expected to say we're seeing unprecedented security challenges. The UK remains one of the few NATO members meeting the alliance's requirement to spend at least 2% of national income on defence. The Chancellor is set to outline so-called evolutionary pension reforms to boost economic growth. Jeremy Hunt plans to make changes to pension funds, encouraging investors to support fast-growing businesses. Well, in a speech tomorrow, he's expected to say the changes will be gradual, not drastic. The government says the aim is to help savers, pension schemes and the UK. Concerns have been raised about the thousands of displaced Ukrainians who are still in temporary accommodation in Scotland. The Liberal Democrats say more than 3,000 Ukrainians are still in hotels and around 700 are on board the MS Victoria cruise ship. The party says progress has been slow and it criticised the lack of resources. The government says it's working on longer-term housing. And the Met Office is warning of more heavy showers and thunderstorms later. It's after rain and storms disrupted major sporting events like Wimbledon and the Ashes yesterday. Well, the Met Office is predicting prolonged heavy rain in Scotland, while Northern Ireland will face strong winds, hail and potential flooding. Heavy showers are also expected to hit Wales, the Midlands and southwest England. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn, this is GB News. Now though...
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lots more to come. I'm going to be speaking to former Tory leader Sir Ian Duncan Smith in just a minute. Sir Simon Mayall is the US right to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. I'm going to be asking that of the former Deputy Chief of Defence Staff. And Mozammel Hossain, who's the Tory hopeful trying to win London. He's going to be speaking to me about his background growing up in abject poverty in Bangladesh. But Sir Ian Duncan Smith, as billed, former Tory leader, MP for Chingford and Woodford Green, joins me now. So Ian, lovely to see you, fresh from Ukraine, which we'll get onto in just a minute.
Morning,
now, I know you've seen the front pages of the newspapers. The Sun on Sunday reporting BBC star sent pants pic to teen. Mum's shock at X-rated mobile image. Do you think this household name should have been suspended immediately, that these allegations came to light pending investigation? The BBC have bungled this, haven't they?
Yeah, I don't quite know what they're doing. It's in a mess, clearly. If you read the newspaper reports, you can see that the BBC has tried to play this down from the beginning. And it's not worked because it's exploded. They don't have any plan. Any inquiries that are taking place seem to be a mess. And that's led to a whole series of reputational damage across the newspapers to the BBC. The BBC should act like everybody else does, immediately suspend somebody pending the investigation.
Yes.
And that way it's clear and then they can get on with it. At this stage, try and do it quietly and behind the scenes. It never works because somebody's blown the gaff and they're in trouble over it.
Now, I know you've just come back from Ukraine, literally in
Yep.
the last 24 hours. Where have you been and what have you been doing?
Well, I went with Labour MP Rushnara Ali. I've been working with a charity called Siobhan's Trust that went out there of their own accord, very British sort of wonderful way of doing things. Right at the beginning of the war, they've been feeding displaced people, first of all up and around the border, but they've moved right down close to the front.
Right.
They do it through pizzas. They have these big pizza trucks going around cooking these pizzas. It brings a bit of joy to people's hearts.
How are people out there? I mean, what's the
Well, you know,
morale?
they're worried. They want this offensive to succeed, but there are many of them you find living in very small accommodation, multiple children, all this sort of stuff, because their husbands, their partners are at the front, and they can't fend for themselves. So the charity brings a bit of joy in their hearts, and it's great to see. They've done over 1 million pizzas to people near the front, families that are destitute, etc., which is part of what we do. And there you learn a lot about what's going on
Yes.
and the difficulties they face. And we had lots of meetings with Ukrainian military people as well as some British military people.
Well,
around
having been on the ground there, I wondered what you made of Joe Biden's suggestion or indeed willingness to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. There's some concern about this. The UK, the French and the Germans are saying, not sure this is a good idea because of the collateral damage caused to civilians. What do you think?
Well, I don't normally get on very well with Joe Biden, but I have to say that I think the Americans are right on this. They've been asked for these by the Ukrainians for a long time because they're facing cluster munitions from Russia. It's all very well for us to sit back and say, oh, we don't like the idea of cluster munitions. But the Russians are using them every day on them, and therefore their problem is twofold. Number one, they still haven't received from NATO enough artillery ammunition. So had they had all that artillery ammunition, they probably wouldn't be making this request because they would have been able to pound those Russian positions very directly. But right now they suffer two problems. There's a huge minefield the Russians have put across all the way across Ukraine. It's very deep. And they don't have the right equipment to clear those minefields, which has led to a slower advance than was originally anticipated, mostly because we aren't able to supply them, not the British necessarily, but everybody hasn't supplied them with the right levels of ammunition, and they need that desperately. There is a huge stockpile of these in America, which were never destroyed, and that's why they've asked for those, because they're otherwise not getting the level of ammunition supply.
But have the West been found asleep at the wheel here? You're talking about dragging their feet generally on weapons. Obviously, we're still having this debate over air support. What's your view on that?
We should have done this ages before.
Cluster bombs or air support?
Well, both. The cluster bombs. The cluster bombs are there because we haven't done enough in artillery support. I'm not blaming the UK because the UK has probably done more than most.
The Americans.
But the Americans, Americans and the British have done quite a lot. But the biggest problem with the Americans at the moment is the absence of training for pilots on F-16s. I think the Dutch and the Danes are ready to give their F-16s, but their pilots need to be trained. The UK jumped the gun, quite rightly, and said they'd start training, I think, in August. But now President Biden has reacted, which is why we understand he didn't allow Ben Wallace to become the candidate.
What do you think of that?
Well, I thought that if it's true, I think it's a ridiculously petty way of doing it.
You're talking about Ben Wallace being blocked from being the head of NATO.
He would have been the perfect
Jens
head.
Stoltenberg's been given another year.
I know.
There's talk of Ursula von der Leyen.
I know. She was
an abject failure as
Well, she's the one that slashed all their defence spending, which is why they had next to no equipment when the Ukraine war broke out.
So you wouldn't support von der Leyen?
No, I think Ben would have been a perfect position. He's well trusted by everybody there as well.
But is that a sign of Biden's sort of anti-Britishness? We saw this come out when he visited Dublin for longer than Northern Ireland. He's made a number of different comments, hasn't he, that seem to be not exactly nurturing the special relationship?
I think so. I think somebody described him as viscerally anti-British, coming from his mother, etc. But I don't know whether he is or he's not, but I do know that right now there is a big division about attitudes to the UK and America. The Republicans are very keen on strong ties with the UK. All of their candidates have said so. He is not as keen. He's more lukewarm. He's trying to forge new links with the French and the Germans. But what they find, the Americans, every time is that these countries don't do anything like the amount of support that comes from the UK when the America's in trouble.
Yes.
And I've always said when America and Britain are parted for various reasons, that's when disasters happen like Vietnam, etc., because we're not there to help get the direction right. So it's important. The UK-US alliance is still the strongest there is because of the amount we spend on defence and the amount of cooperation we have on intelligence.
Would the West be stronger with Donald Trump as president again?
I don't think Trump will make a great president if he gets elected. I would rather see the others. There's good candidates in the Republican Party at the moment to get elected, and I think it'd be a good idea if some of those get a real crack of the whip. Well, I like the governor of Florida very well, but I also like Mike Pompeo, was an excellent state secretary, very good.
But I'm just thinking about your concerns about China, not just Russia, and the idea that actually Biden's been weak, and he's been weak on behalf of the West, and whether you agree with that.
Well, the one thing America has been quite strong on China, and, I'm sanctioned by the Chinese government for calling out the...
You wear that like a badge of honour.
Well, I try to avoid it like a badge of honour. Otherwise, my family gets sanctioned alongside me as well. So, but the Americans, by and large, the one area they are united on generally is on China.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important point.
Should Ukraine be fast-tracked into NATO?
I think there needs to be a strong process that acknowledges NATO's destination, rather than the destination of the Ukraine, will be at some point in NATO. I understand why NATO is concerned about doing this right now, because this would then suck NATO into more commitment, which would include ground forces to protect Ukraine from Article 5, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. So I can understand why there's hesitation, but we need to send stronger signals that the direction of travel for the Ukraine, all things being equal, is entry into NATO. And that's what they're asking. They know they can't get entry now. They're just asking for some process that says there is a process now, we're accepting that your destination in due course is likely to be there, but it won't happen immediately.
Before we get on to Tory matters, I was intrigued by your response to the SNP suggestion that drugs should be decriminalised, because I know you've done a lot of work on this for the Centre for Social Justice. This is your think tank.
Yep.
Should drugs be decriminalised, or is this absolutely a ridiculous idea?
Anybody that does the work in this knows it's bonkers. It doesn't work. It's been tried everywhere. The moment you do, what happens is the amount of drug taking rises. Gangs love this idea. I happen to know that criminal gangs were whooping with delight when they heard this announcement. We know we've got contacts. The truth is, that's what they want, because that increases, therefore, the likelihood. A lot of the threat of criminality is one of the reasons why you stifle some of the purchasing power, which keeps the market slightly more under control.
Yeah.
The idea that the war on drugs hasn't been won. You're never going to win an absolute ban on drugs, but what you do is you narrow the marketplace and therefore make it more difficult for people to get drugs, means they're less likely to take it. And that means you have to treat those. Right now, we have a serious crisis going on in drug treatment. What we need is more rehabilitation, not just opening the doors to drugs.
The Tories that have cut funding to drug rehabilitation.
Well, and
alcohol funding.
Well, this has gone on for a while. I've been involved in these organisations, the Centre for Social Justice. The key thing is now better rehabilitation with real choices about outcomes. If you said, look, you can either take the criminal course or you can go to rehabilitation like they do in Sweden and Norway, then that would be a better route for us to take.
Let's move on to tax. Hunter's ruled out any tax cuts before the next general election. Is that lunacy?
Well, the government always say one thing and then eventually do...
But should he?
Well, I personally believe we have to get the economy moving. Far too many people are now suffering because of the issues. I understand of that. A lot of organised chaos by the bank in terms of the inflation level. So interest rates have risen to a degree. I'm worried we're going to overkill the economy with interest rates. So I think what we have to do, and I'm sure they're doing, is to plan to make sure we can get tax burdens down.
But do you think Rishi Sunak's doing well? I mean, you backed Boris. He's not delivering his 5 deliverables.
Well, there are some externals that are causing a real problem to him, I have to tell you. And I keep coming back to the fact the bank is responsible for quite a big chunk of why our inflation rate is so high and why interest rates are higher. Get beyond that. What do I instinctively believe that he wants to do? I believe he wants to reduce the burden of taxation.
But you've got 5 deliverables that can't seem to be delivered. We've got the potential for 5 by-elections. We've got some of your colleagues talking about how you could do with a period in opposition. I'd love to hear from you, as a former leader in opposition, whether that's a good idea.
I think only people who've never been in opposition look forward to opposition. Opposition is a desert in which nobody really wants to listen to you for a while because they're all interested in the government. And so you have your infighting and all the other problems go on. It makes it more difficult. The answer is we've got to get our act together now. And I think, therefore, people want to see a choice at the next election. Right now, Labour said next to nothing about their policies. They're getting away with just drifting along on the basis all will be better under Labour. We need to be very clear about what the choice will be at the next election.
But you're in a really marginal seat. Are you going to win that seat?
Well, I'm certainly going to fight it, and I plan to win it, but like everything else,
but are
it's
you
up to my
worried? Are you worried we
constituents.
might be facing some kind of Tory apocalypse come 2024?
I don't think this is 1996, 97. I went through that, and it was different. They could name you who the leader of the Labour Party was on the doorstep, Tony Blair. They thought they had a Scottish banker, solid, dependable, sitting next to him, and that this was like a soft Tory party. Then none of that takes place when you're on the doorstep. They can't name you who the leader of the Labour Party is. They don't know a single policy that they've got. They don't know anything at all about the nature of the Labour Party post-Corbyn. So they're talking about anger with us because of the problems, quite rightly so. But what they're not able to say to you is, I know why I want to vote for the other side. What they're saying at the moment is, I'm not going to vote for you. So the question is, can we in the next 12 months sort that out and give them that choice, let them know that the only way to get this done, post the worst crisis we've ever had, we always forget COVID punched a hole through every single area of government. And so getting this sorted now and giving them that choice, that is a lower tax base, lower burden, get government off your backs all the time, all that stuff is, to me, sensible.
So, Ian, thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Pleasure.
Especially as you're slightly, well, not jet-lagged, but you've had a long journey home.
Train lag.
Now, Olivia, what have the people of Medway made of the interviews?
Thank you, Camilla. Our People's panellists here have been listening very closely, and I've heard a few guffaws, I've heard a bit of frustration, and I've seen some nodding. So let's find out what our People's panellists have to say. And I'm going to start with you this time, Martin. You were speaking before about we were talking about the state of the NHS, and Alan Milburn there was talking about what he would do now. What did you make of that interview?
Well, I'd ask him why didn't he do the reforms when he was minister? It's something that's been passed around. Election after election after election, it's being used as a political football. We will do this, we will do that. The NHS is the biggest employer in Europe, the largest employer in Europe. I think last year's bill was 150 billion, this year's 180 billion. How much more money do you need to keep throwing at this thing before somebody makes it work? And I think the only thing to do is to reform it, is to take it out of the hands of government control and put it into people who know what they're doing with business.
Lots of frustration there, definitely, but I've heard a plan from you, Martin, which is perhaps more than we've heard from some politicians lately. And Ben, what did you make of what we heard those two politicians saying? We had a Labour MP, former Labour advisor and former MP there, and then we had Ian Duncan Smith talking about the state of the Conservative Party, and he seemed quite frustrated, actually, with the way his party's working. He said that anger on the doorsteps was completely understandable. What did you make of that? Do you think if someone like Ian Duncan Smith is saying the Tories have problems, then these by-elections are looking pretty dicey?
Oh, 100% agree with him. I think that the Conservative Party is slowly destroying itself. We never would have imagined this back in 2019, but you reap what you sow in the end, and I start to think that maybe Peter Hitchens was right all along. Maybe the Conservative Party does need to be destroyed in order to make way for another right-wing party, but who knows? But they are going to get heavily punished in the next year or so.
Ian Duncan Smith there was saying that there are people who say that a spell in opposition would be good for the Tories, but actually those are only people who don't know what it's like being in opposition. What do you think? Do you think the Tories now sort of deserve to lose and have a bit of a dark spell to regroup, or would that be a nightmare?
Yeah, I do think sometimes losing helps. It gets you back to the drawing room, get back to the meeting room saying, where did it go wrong? Let's fix this so we can win the next match. So I'm not entirely sure. I'm not saying it's entirely bad, but I just don't see them recovering from it at all, because people say, what did you do for 13 years? You were rubbish. Why should we expect you to give you another chance in 2029? So it may work, or it may not. We'll have to wait and see.
And do you think Keir Starmer, I mean, Ian Duncan Smith there was saying that this isn't anything like 1997. People knew who Tony Blair was. People, he thinks, don't really know who Keir Starmer is. Do you think that that is a problem for Labour going into the election, or is it enough simply not being the Conservatives?
Yes, it is a big problem, because if you just stay back, it's the classic example of the tortoise and the hare. Keir Starmer is the tortoise, just slowly walking his way to victory, and the hare is running all around thinking, I'm going to win this comfortably. Oh no, I've lost. All he has to do is just sit back and just say, I don't have to answer questions, or I don't have to talk about wokeism or anything like this. And it's like, no, this is not 1997. If this was Tony Blair, he would have absolutely hounded this out and got people like me and everywhere else in Medway or Kent or big stronghold Conservative seats to vote Labour. No one is going to do that.
Well, thank you very much. Again, a pretty stark warning for Labour there. And Paul, what did you make of what you heard there? Did anything that either of those politicians say persuade you that you could change what you might vote for at the next election, or are you pretty set in stone?
No, not at all, really. I mean, well, the Conservatives are imploding. You know what I mean? They haven't got any policies going together. You know what I mean? Richie's got his bit, but no one else seems to be backing him. You know, and Labour. No.
Well, Labour, that's our verdict here in Medway. I think actually you speak for quite a lot of the country when you say that. So thank you very much to all our brilliant People's panellists, and thank you to Steve and Tiny Tims for having us here. For now, back to Camilla in the studio.
Thank you for that, Olivia. I love this. There's a degree of exasperation on the People's panel today. Labour, who knows? Maybe they'll send us one of their shadow ministers so we can actually discuss these issues with them directly. We live in hope. Now, Sir Simon Mayall joins me now. He's former Army General and former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, therefore the perfect man to discuss with me all things Ukrainian and beyond. Let's talk first of all about Joe Biden's suggestion that the US are going to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. Now, I know the French, the Germans and indeed the British have concerns about these cluster bombs. What do you think?
Well, I think it's the right move, I'm afraid. Right. It's the word cluster bomb, or the words cluster bomb, do summon up a very, very emotive issue to do with conventional weaponry. Part of the reason, and I think Ian Duncan Smith referred to it, is that we haven't been able to provide Ukraine with enough what I would call old-fashioned conventional munitions. We're not addressing enough in terms of getting the production lines running again. And, of course, the whole cluster munitions technology has moved on.
I'm very conscious. Worried about collateral damage, the threat to civilians? We don't want to be killing more innocent people in Ukraine.
Well, I think in the areas that where the Ukrainians would use them, there are very few civilians left. We're talking about the huge defensive minefield belts the Russians have put in areas, I'm afraid, like Bakhmut, which have been fought over for months. And in some ways, the stalemate means that we're going to continue to have people being killed, including, of course, you know, civilians every day are being killed by the Russians as part of collateral damage.
So it's a yes to cluster bombs. And what's your view on the failure so far for the West to supply this air support? I know we're training fighter pilots, but we're not actually sending air support. Is that an error? Could we have helped the Ukrainians win this war already?
Well, one's got to be realistic. This, you know, war is politics by other means. Yes. You know, we're talking about an alliance. We're talking about keeping up, you know, NATO strongly together. We don't need to break ranks. The key people in this are the Americans. It's no good trying to beat the Americans up. They've provided 80% of the munitions so far. I think they felt they were slightly nudged into the support for F-16s by Britain and Ben Wallace. I think it was the right thing to do. But ultimately, you need to take the Americans with you on this one. Yeah. There's no doubt about it, of course, if the Ukrainians had that capability earlier on, it might be a different story on the ground.
But we couldn't take the Americans with us when it came to Ben Wallace being the head of NATO.
No, I agree. And
do you think that's an error by Biden?
Well, I personally absolutely do think it's an error. I think Ben Wallace is, of all the candidates I've seen, is the best qualified. And I think Britain has been the most stalwart in making the case for support to Ukraine. It's been one of the most stalwart members of NATO. It's a Security Council, a permanent Security Council member. It's been a very close ally of the Americans. And I think the way it's been slightly personalised is unfortunate. I would also say that I think, going back to cluster munitions, it's a pity that the Americans have made the issue of cluster weapons the issue just before we go into a very, very important NATO summit at Vilnius this week.
And von der Leyen, what do you think about her name being in the frame? I mean, I find that ironic considering that Germany has been criticised for dragging its feet on providing weaponry to the Ukraine, and also she didn't have a particularly illustrious history of Defence Secretary there.
No, well, I wouldn't want to make sort of ad hominem attacks, but as you quite rightly say, one of the reasons the Germans were so recalcitrant in supporting Ukraine was they couldn't support it with anything. And a lot of that have happened on Ursula von der Leyen's watch when she was Defence Minister.
NATO, she?
Well, I would argue not. I see where the French and the Germans might be coming from. They want, in inverted commas, one of theirs at the top. But I want nothing that gives any more credence to the idea of this European defence identity when NATO is absolutely the rock-solid basis on which our security rests. That's all of us in NATO and most of us in the EU.
What's your analysis well, indeed. What's your analysis of where Russia is now following Prigozhin's failed coup attempt? I mean, there were some interesting images out of the Kremlin in the week featuring him in various disguises, this idea of trying to humiliate him. Is this bloke still alive? What's What do we think the thinking is around Putin and his future at the Kremlin?
Well, he has. I mean, Prigozhin has really revealed the sort of weakness of Putin's position. You know, he is dependent on these psychotics, you know, like the people who run Wagner Group. If I was Prigozhin, I'd stay away from, you know, balconies on high-rise buildings. And I'd certainly stick to water rather than tea.
Yes, right.
But there has
avoid any pointy umbrellas.
Yeah, but you know, Wagner Group have taken a hell of a kicking because they've been put into the front line by the Russian army, who don't like them. Putin has now, as a result of Prigozhin's actions, tried to absorb Wagner Group into the military as a sort of element of the state, not as a private military security company. And it can't be much fun, inverted commas, for the Russian soldiers to be looking left and right and seeing, you know, you couldn't be unaware of what's going on back in Moscow or alongside you with Wagner Group, let alone the fact that you've got, you know, NATO, you know, supplying the Ukrainians who are proving to be very redoubtable opponents.
Well, let's talk about them. I mean, does it strengthen Ukraine's position? There's obviously talk about them being fast-tracked into NATO. Would you agree with that? Or do you think that might provoke the Russians even further?
Well, I don't think, given that it is all about a defensive alliance,
yes,
you know, and it is an attack on one, it's an attack on all, you know, we can have a debate on that if it was challenged, but the idea of bringing the Ukraine in while it's still in the middle of a shooting war with Russia is fanciful. And I hope the Ukrainians, whatever they're offered at Vilnius, and I think it will be very substantial.
Yeah, this is the NATO summit next week.
The NATO summit next week, sorry. Don't view the fact that they're not going to be fast-tracked as a loss. There will be a very, very strong rhetoric about commitment. There'll be a huge package.
Yes.
I know within that is this slightly, you know, controversial issue of cluster munitions. But Ukraine should go away very satisfied, and I hope they sell that up.
Yes. Because
it would be inconceivable that NATO would accept Ukraine into NATO at a time when they could then invoke Article 5 end of defence and call NATO's bluff.
Mindful of the fact we've just got a minute left, so Simon, I'm going to ask you a big question, but how does this end?
Well, at the moment it ends in sort of stalemate, which is why it is so important that the Ukrainians get in a really strong position.
I mean, can they reclaim some of this territory?
I doubt if they can reclaim it all unless there's a collapse in the Russian front line. If the army refused to fight, and historically there have been examples of that.
I mean,
if not, we need to put them in because I think Putin...
Are they winning this? Are the Russians losing? It's quite hard to quantify how this might play out.
It's very hard to quantify. It's very hard to quantify. Do not underestimate the capacity for the Russians for sacrifice and the depth Russia has still. It has the capacity to continue this war for a long time, unless, as I say, the people in the front line refuse to fight and die for what they now view to be.
Do you see this playing out for years?
I see it potentially playing out for years. Hence, you know, the reluctance to provide cluster weapons at a time when we're providing everything else would just absolutely hamper the ability of the Ukrainians to at least get an operational success that could be turned into strategic political advantage.
And a final word on our own defences. Obviously, we keep on having this row about defence spending, whether it's enough of GDP. Are we adequately defended? Are we spending enough on defence?
Well, I would argue not. And I think we are seeing the results of not spending that amount and thinking that numbers don't count. Because if you act small, you think small. If you think small, you start to be treated small. And we lose diplomatic and political leverage by not really investing in our armed forces, then using them imaginatively in those arenas.
So, Simon, lovely to speak to you this morning. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Camilla.
Well, don't go anywhere, because in just a minute I'll be meeting the man who's hoping to become the next Mayor of London. But first, here's the weather.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. Well, it's another day of sunshine and showers across the country today. Some of them will be heavy at times and a little fresher for everyone. Looking at the bigger picture, low pressure still sits to the west of the UK, drawing in these showers and longer spells of rain over the next few days. In fact, some of this rain will be heavy at times and turning quite persistent for some on Monday. For the rest of Sunday, plenty of sunny spells, more in the way of sunshine compared to Saturday, though there will be some heavy showers. Thundery across Northern Ireland, Wales, the Midlands down into southwest England, so there could be some local disruption with a Met Office warning in force. Elsewhere, drier, temperatures generally in the low 20s, perhaps locally around 24 or 25 across southeast England this afternoon. Those thundery showers continue to push northwards as we head through the evening, but then fade away by the end of the day. And then overnight it's generally dry with clear spells across much of the country, but then towards the end of the night we just start to see a few showers pushing in from the southwest as that low pressure system starts to edge nearer. Temperatures generally around the mid-teens, so still quite warm for the time of year. Plenty of sunshine first thing Monday morning, but the clouds gather from the southwest. Areas of rain start to move in, so parts of Wales will see some heavy downpours developing. Elsewhere during the afternoon on Monday, it's a case of sunny spells and scattered showers. Temperatures similar once more, generally reaching the low 20s for most, perhaps 24, 25 degrees across southeast England. Into the evening time on Monday, further pulses of rain continue to push northwards. Another area pushing into southwest England through towards the end of the day, which could be heavy at times. Still, the odd rumble of thunder is possible too. And going forward, further showers and longer spells of rain is in the forecast, and temperatures around average.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Now, can the Tories overthrow Sadiq Khan in London? In just a minute, I'm going to be speaking to Mozammel Hossain, the man who's hoping to become the next mayor. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. I'm joined in the studio by Mozammel Hossain Casey. I always say QC. I'm still in old language. Casey, he's a criminal barrister and he's hoping to be the Tory candidate for London Mayor. It's going to be part of a series of interviews looking ahead to the 2024 London mayoral election. Next week, we're hoping to speak to the other Tory seeking the nomination, Susan Hall. Sadiq Khan, if you're watching, we'd love to welcome you to GB News. Please do get involved. But Moz, that's your nickname, so you allow me to call me Moz if you don't mind. Just tell us a bit about your background, because you've got such an interesting backstory, and I'm intrigued as to how a boy born in abject poverty in Bangladesh ends up running to be the London mayor.
Thank you for having me, Camilla. It's great to be here. So I left my then home at the age of 21, a wooden house, mud floor, under a tin roof, and a sobbing mother.
Yes.
To come to England. I didn't have shoes until I was 16, because you don't wear shoes in the village. It's, all muddy trucks. And so by 21, I was studying law in the UK, in Liverpool.
Wow, which is an achievement in itself.
Yes, because it's the way the family did it. My parents had very little to give us, so they gave us education.
Yes.
And they taught us value of hard work. So the way they have done it, they send the eldest child to university, the very first in the village to go to university. He sets up a small business, then he pays for the second boy. And when he has a job, he looks after the younger ones.
Yes.
Then the other two brothers put money together to send the third boy to come to England.
So when you first came to the UK, having not worn shoes until you were 16 years old, it must have been a bit of a shock to the system.
I was excited. I was so excited. I was very cold when I came here.
I can only imagine.
Nobody told me that this is very cold in England in September, so I was freezing cold.
And you've been a criminal barrister for many years, so why do this? Why leave this lucrative career behind to try and run to be London mayor?
As you say, Camilla, a boy from village in Bangladesh was provided with all the opportunities by London and allowed him to reach to the top of the legal profession. Look at London now. It isn't safe. It isn't affordable. And Mr. Khan has let London down, and you may think opportunities suffocate in a city that isn't safe, that is unaffordable. So I want to give back to the city that has given me everything. And also, Camilla, I think forget about a boy from Bangladesh, a boy from Bromley, or a girl from Greenwich, wouldn't have the same opportunities I have had.
Yes. Now, I hear, having read the Sunday Telegraph this morning, that you've got some key donors who are injecting a lot of cash into your campaign, Nick Candy and others. We know he's not short of a few bob. So have you amassed a multi-million-pound war chest?
Look, people are excited. Look, I have met many people. I've met many industry leaders and business leaders. They're coming to me because they say to me they do not want a city that is unsafe.
Yeah.
They do not want a city where... Because nobody will come to a city. London is the greatest city, Camilla. It is not political cliché on the planet. No city can compete with London as long as you get few things right. Safety.
Yes.
If it's safe, if it's affordable for young people, talk to any young people now, Camilla, they don't dream of owning homes anymore. They can't simply afford to rent.
But you're totally untried and untested, so these Tory donors are looking to you. Why? Why have you got a better chance of beating Khan than, say, Susan Hall?
I'm not tried and untested. I have been a criminal barrister and a QC for 4 years, Casey now.
Yes.
Coming from a village in Bangladesh, if I can be a King's Counsel, I'm not...
Yeah, but does that qualify you to be London mayor and run the capital?
Of course.
That's the question.
I mean, often people say, oh, you're not a politician. I think that's not a vice. If anything, that's a good thing. People are fed up with career politicians.
Yeah.
I am doing it because I genuinely care about changing lives.
Yes.
London has given me everything I have. I want to give back.
Name your 3 flagship policies. What 3 things would you do if you do get the keys to City Hall?
Number 1, talk to anybody, Camilla. Rich, poor, men, women, they all say how unsafe they feel in London.
Yeah. More stop and search then?
Yes.
What's the solution?
To so increase intelligence-based stop and search. We have to do that. We have to bring back trust in Met, reform Met, refocus their priorities.
More police officers?
Yes, of course. Neighbourhood policing, day and night. Not only just sort of in their cars, they must come out on the street.
So you're an advocate for visible policing?
Definitely. Why not? Look, all these things worked. Why not go back to things that worked before?
Yeah.
I mean, when was the last time you saw a police officer on foot at night? You never see them.
OK, so cut crime.
Cut crime.
By more visible policing. Second policy?
And then housing. as I mentioned before, talk to any young... Do you want me to talk about crime or move on to housing?
Move on to housing, just for timing.
Housing. Look, so I was out for dinner with a friend. She's young, she's 22, and she just finished at St. Martin's. And she says, look, all her friends who wants to work in film industry or in animation, architecture, she's an sculptor, they simply cannot afford to...
OK, so build more housing? How many more homes?
So look, there's enough brownfield land in London and Box to build.
OK, but have you set a target?
I think targets, as long as you build more beautifully and affordable homes for people, I think build as much as you can. I think hundreds of thousands of beautiful homes is my plan.
OK, and third policy?
And third would be transport.
Yes.
Mr. Khan doesn't simply care about outer London because he can ignore them. I have been going around all parts of outer London, all of London, and despite all the flaws, transport in inner London is pretty good.
So you're saying Sadiq Khan doesn't care about outer London?
But talk to anybody in outer London, they will say it's how awful the connectivity is in outer London.
Well, he wants to impose the ULEZ on outer London.
It's cruel. It's the most cruel thing to do during the worst cost of living crisis. May I give an example? I know politicians like talking about the stories. Let me tell you. 2 weeks ago, I was in Hillingdon, talking to a young lady, lives in a council flat, at clean at his school, pays £250 a month for gas and electricity, and said, how on earth I'm going to pay £12.50 a month on
So you're saying that Khan's penalising the poor with this policy?
Of course he is. I mean, it's a cruel thing to do during the worst cost of living crisis, Camilla.
Right, to finish, so we can get a measure of you, I'm going to ask you a few yes or no questions, and the prerequisite here is, I need to be specific. You're a lawyer, so you understand specifics.
Yeah.
You have to answer yes or no.
Do I have to?
Yes, you do.
OK.
OK, first question. Net zero by 2030, yes or no?
It's impossible. It's impossible.
So you're saying no?
No, look, it's a great ambition, but it's not going to happen.
So would you support net zero by 2030?
I think as an ambition...
This isn't a yes or no, Moz.
OK, as an ambition, support it, but it don't happen.
OK. Should we ban diesels and petrols in 2030, yes or no?
Again, this is so unrealistic.
Why? That's what the suggestion is by the government. Do you agree with it? Do you agree with banning diesel and petrol cars, yes or no?
I think if it's possible...
Tory policy.
OK, I think it's a good ambition to have.
So you do support that?
I think it's a good ambition to have.
All right. Do you support the Rwanda plan, yes or no?
Look, we have to find a way. I mean,
Moz, you're prevaricating
I know, but I can't give it...
Yes or no?
Look,
yes or no game. It's the yes or no game. I'm going to ask Susan Hall the same question.
We have to stop illegal immigration and...
So you support your Rwanda, yes or no?
No, look, we have to find the effective way to stop this.
Do you support Rwanda, yes or no?
My answer has to be, Camilla, I'm afraid that we have to find... I support the government...
Moz, you have to answer yes or no. You must know whether you support the Rwanda plan or not.
But I think we have to find a way to stop this ghastly criminal gangs.
So you do support Rwanda?
Look, there's a legal process going on at the moment.
Moz,
I think
you've got to answer yes or no questions,
but
honestly,
it would be
because
wrong.
Otherwise the electorate will just despair. This is a massive issue for Londoners. A lot of them are immigrants, yourself included.
Yes.
Do you support Rwanda, yes or no?
Look, do I support any measures to stop illegal immigration? Yes.
So you do support the Rwanda plan? Why won't you commit to that?
There's a legal process going. It would be wrong. As a King's Counsel, somebody who defends the legal system, I think there's a process going on.
You voted Remain. Should we rejoin the EU? Yes or no?
I mean, look, we have to unlock the benefits.
Rejoin the EU? Yes or no?
That question has been litigated on. We'll move on.
Does a woman have a penis? Yes or no?
I think we all know women don't.
That's a no.
Yeah,
Thank you for that. That's better than the Labour leader can achieve. Gay marriage, yes or no?
Look, we have gay marriage.
Yes. Do you support it?
Yeah, of course.
Should we leave the ECHR? Yes or no?
Look, I think my answer is this. Look, we now have control of our laws and regulations.
Yes or no?
It's a tricky one, really. I'm afraid I can't.
All right. And finally, were the Tories wrong to get rid of Boris? Yes or no?
Look, Camilla,
yes or no?
I'm here to talk about London. He was a great mayor of London. I'm here to talk about that.
All right.
Not about Westminster politics.
Fair enough. Moz Hossain, good luck.
Thank you.
In the race. Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
You stay where you are. Don't go anywhere.
Stay here.
Now, and don't go. You don't go anywhere. He's not going anywhere. You don't go anywhere either. Because after the NHS this week celebrated its 75th birthday, we've got a generation gap debate just after the news about whether we should see more privatisation in the NHS. As I said. Welcome back. Now it's time for our Generation Gap, the part of the show where people from different generations debate hot political topics. This week, after the NHS celebrated its 75th birthday, we're asking, should we see fundamental reform to the UK's healthcare system, and should privatisation be playing a bigger role? Fatima Kamara, registered nurse and now a senior management executive in the NHS, joins me along with, along with Labour councillor in Runnymede and Elmbridge Borough Council, Len Shackleton. No, I've got that wrong. Sorry. This is... Can I blame the person who's written the autocue for this? Yeah. Fatima, you're the Labour councillor in Runnymede and Elmbridge Borough Council. Len, you're a fellow at the free market think tank, the IEO, and you're also a professor of economics, IEA, and a professor of economics at the University of Buckingham. This has all gone well. I'm throwing that away. I'm firing several people that write the script, and we're getting into this debate. Now, Fatima, let's start with you. We've heard Tony Blair talk about privatisation of the NHS, the idea of wealthier people jumping the queue. Why don't we just charge for appointments, fine people who are late or don't turn up, and make more money for the NHS to be better?
Thank you, Camilla, for having me this morning. Thank you for inviting me in. I think certainly I don't agree with the point of privatisation for the NHS.
Just a little bit.
I think definitely how the NHS was set up in 1945, it's moved on quite a lot in heaps and bounds, but privatisation, we can see just an example from the US healthcare system, where it has quite a lot of challenges, and in that as well, the NHS was set up as free at the point of use.
I know, but Len, come into this debate, because I get exactly what you're saying. Nobody wants to compromise or indeed sacrifice that initial very noble aim of the NHS, but it's become bloated beyond all recognition from a managerial perspective, and patients aren't being adequately served, even though there's been record investment in the NHS. I know we can have an argument about whether it's linked to inflation or not, but more money's been poured in, Len. What's the solution here?
It has indeed. Loads of money has been poured in, and we're now spending as much as a proportion of our GDP as any of our sort of competitors in Europe and so on. And yet the results are not very good. You know, we've dropped down the league tables in terms of, things like cancer, heart attacks and so forth. And the system is actually, I mean, one of the things that bothers me about the system, Camilla, is that it's a national illness service.
Yeah.
You go to the doctor when there's something wrong with you. You don't get screened on a regular basis. You don't get health checks on a regular basis.
Bringing in more health MOTs. They announced that a couple of weeks ago, Steve Barclay. Fatima, surely if you're pro-NHS and you're pro-patients being more responsible to it, why would you be against, for instance, fining people who waste your time and the time of fellow clinicians?
I think what I would say is definitely based on the point that Len has actually said. There's definitely a point for reviewing and looking at reforming somehow the NHS, but that doesn't mean that, rightfully, as we've said, a lot of money has gone into it. Doesn't mean that, you know, pumping a lot of more money into it can save what's happening.
So if we need reform, how about a Royal Commission? Sajid Javid, the former Health Secretary, suggested that last week. Should we have a Royal Commission look at this, take it out of politics and just have an independent body make changes to the NHS to make it better? Yes or no, Fatima?
I think you have to give people, the citizens, you have to give them the right to look at what sort of services they want locally and give them that power back that they need. And also, we have to also realise that we're not talking in isolation about the NHS. There's also social care that needs to be sorted out.
Response to Fatima, quickly.
On the Royal Commission idea, I think that's probably a good idea, but Royal Commissions take forever, and it must be given a very tight brief and a very tight period in which to report. We need to get the NHS changed within the next year or two, really. We don't want the thing dragging on forever, kicked into the long grass once again.
Now, I'm afraid we've run out of time, because the show has just been one of those shows. And we're going to be speaking to lots of people next week at 9:30, as ever. And we've now got Angela Rippon coming up, who's going to be covering Michael Portillo's show. I know she's got some great guests on, including Lord Owen and others. So do stay tuned for that. And we'll be back next week at 9:30.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. Well, it's another day of sunshine and showers across the country today. Some of them will be heavy at times and a little fresher for everyone. Looking at the bigger picture, low pressure still sits to the west of the UK, drawing in these showers and longer spells of rain over the next few days. In fact, some of this rain will be heavy at times and turning quite persistent for some on Monday. For the rest of Sunday, plenty of sunny spells, more in the way of sunshine compared to Saturday, though there will be some heavy showers. Thundery across Northern Ireland, Wales, the Midlands down into southwest England, so there could be some local disruption with a Met Office warning in force. Elsewhere, drier, temperatures generally in the low 20s, perhaps locally around 24 or 25 across southeast England this afternoon. Those thundery showers continue to push northwards as we head through the evening, but then fade away by the end of the day, and then overnight it's generally dry with clear spells across much of the country, but then towards the end of the night we just start to see a few showers pushing in from the southwest as that low pressure system starts to edge nearer. Temperatures generally around the mid-teens, so still quite warm for the time of year. Plenty of sunshine first thing Monday morning, but the clouds gather from the southwest. Areas of rain start to move in, so parts of Wales will see some heavy downpours developing. Elsewhere during the afternoon on Monday, it's a case of sunny spells and scattered showers. Temperatures similar once more, generally reaching the low 20s for most, perhaps 24, 25 degrees.